God and his throne. So you get several sort of details that are Old Testament in origin to sort of highlight that's who that's supposed to be. Psalm 2 describes Jesus ruling, or one who would rule with a rod of iron. Daniel 7 describes one like the Son of Man caught up before the throne of heaven. And there are some others we could throw in there as well. Finally, Michael, or not finally, but fourth, in Jude 9 and in Daniel 10, we're introduced to Michael. Okay, Michael is considered I'm going to use the phrase even though it's laden with a lot of baggage, guardian angel of Israel. He's the one that fights Israel's battles. He's on their side doing their thing. That's who Michael is. The rest of the woman's offspring seem to indicate this would be the church. There at the end of the chapter in verse 17, the dragon is furious with the woman and makes war with the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Okay, those people are members of the church. They are members of that group of people considered God's people, all right, after the fact. Now, since I was an ex-teacher, I can ask multiple choice questions and get away with it. Who is the woman? Is the big question in Revelation 12, right? Is she the nation of Israel, the ethnic nation, the descendants of Abraham, the blood family of Abraham? Is the woman the church? Does the woman represent not maybe the blood family of Abraham, but the spiritual family of Abraham, those that have served God in any generation? Or is it the Virgin Mary, right? Because it says a woman gave birth to Jesus, so that might just be her, right? Which one do you suppose?
Yes. The answer is
In
yes.
context, which would...
There are parts of the woman that don't fit any one answer real clearly. Because the woman gives birth to the man-child. Well, that can't be the church, because Jesus gives birth to the church.
Right.
Well, Jesus begets the church. So it can't be representing of New Testament Christianity, because it's giving birth to the one who will create it.
Right.
So that doesn't fit.
So there's like every multiple choice question, there's one that's completely no, right?
Yeah.
Completely not it. And it's definitely the church. The church can't give birth to Jesus. That's out of order, okay?
Right.
What about the other three?
Yeah, Israel could get it because he was from the line of the tribe of Judah.
Right.
So his lineage was from Abraham.
Right.
So that would make sense. Now, the part that doesn't make sense there is that, so Israel went in the wilderness after, and it doesn't seem to fit the
Right.
events, what took place. That's the part, Israel went away.
Right.
After giving birth to the child.
Yeah, and Israel was not considered those who, ethnic Israel is not considered those who held to the testimony of Jesus. They're the ones who killed him, right? Using the Romans to do that. So those two answers are kind of out. We're left with what? Virgin Mary and spiritual nation?
Yeah.
Okay. So what about the Virgin Mary? It's interesting that the Bible is completely disinterested with her after Jesus' birth. Right? There is nothing about her after I say that. At the crucifixion, there's that one line, right? But then, radio silence through the rest of the New Testament concerning her, right? And the way that the woman's described here is different, right, than what we'd expect of Mary. The only answer left is the spiritual nation of Israel, and it's the only one that really makes sense according to all the details. The spiritual nation of Israel is all those who have followed God at any point in time, right? They are considered the people of God. There was a people of God before the crucifixion, correct? Yes. And there was one afterwards as well, right? It was the spiritual nation throughout, which helps us with the story. If it's the spiritual nation of Israel that gave birth to Jesus, it works, right? If it's the spiritual nation of Israel that's pursued by the dragon, it works because that's what's happening with the church, right? All those you got to tie all those together and make it happen, all right? All right, in chapter 12 itself, here's what you find. The first 6 verses are the first 2 signs in this section. Verse 1 says a great sign appeared in heaven, and we're introduced to the woman. And then in verse 2 or 3, I believe it is, another sign appeared in heaven. We kind of get, okay, here's a woman, and then John says, oh, I see another thing. And it's a great sign, a great indicator up in heaven. And this is the dragon, the one who the text spends most of our time on. Verses 7 and 9 sort of almost retells the story, but from a heavenly perspective. Right? This battle between the representatives of good and the representatives of evil, right? Between Michael, the representative of spiritual Israel, and Satan, its enemy, right? Satan loses this battle, and he and all of his are cast down. Verses 10 through 12, you get almost a commentary, right? You get a loud voice in heaven in verse 10, and he's describing, here's the thing that just happened. This is what this means. And he begins speaking. Now the salvation and power and kingdom of our God and authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. They have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even to death. So we have mention of the blood of the Lamb, which points us toward what event? The crucifixion. But it also points forward, because by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even to death. That's not the crucifixion. No. That's post-crucifixion Christianity, right? The martyrs and those who held to the testimony. So we're sort of tying together a lot of events here in this one paragraph. And then finally, we have sort of, present day, right? What was the outpour? What happened afterwards, right? What happened afterwards is because Satan lost against Jesus, he began attacking his followers. And his followers were defended, but the war continues. Right? And that's sort of the way were you going to say something?
I missed the opportunity, but before when you were talking about the spiritual church, I found it interesting. One of the commentaries I looked at made a huge distinction. It wasn't all the spiritual members, it was the Gentiles only.
Yeah, that doesn't fit.
And it makes no sense, because one presumes they're discarding Israel because they were the ones that crucified Jesus and so on and so forth. It made absolutely no sense.
Right. And that's why it has to be more, I call them sometimes God followers, right? Because God followers fits before or after the crucifixion. People that were faithful to God in any covenant sense, right? It also fits the people who were around before Moses. There were God followers that weren't Jews, right? So it's all of God's people leading us through. All right. When you read it, if you had a chance to read it, what was something you saw, something you noticed, something you found interesting or odd or strange? Yeah.
Something that I've heard pointed out that we in general, people tend to get wrong. We don't see Satan and God put on this plane to where they are in conflict. God is up here. Satan is in conflict with angels.
Mm-hmm.
We tend
That's a good
to
point.
get that messed up and put Satan and God on the same plane, and they never are. God is always overall, and God is always in charge.
Mm-hmm.
Satan has conflict with us. He has conflict with angels. He has no conflict with God, because God is greater than him.
Yeah, he cannot bring conflict on God's level or on Jesus' level, right? Even Jesus isn't depicted as being the enemy of Satan. There's this picture floating around, I see it sometimes, of like Jesus and Satan arm wrestling. Have you ever seen this one? Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. And it's like they wouldn't even be in the same weight class. You're talking God versus a lower creature, life form, if you want to think about it like that. Right? So, and it's one point this text makes is that Satan fought with Michael and still lost. Right? I heard another. Yes, sir.
I was just going to make a similar comment, make an observation that it's interesting. Satan fought against an angel of God, Michael, not against God, which is what he was saying. But I'm just saying, when you look at it, it's an angel versus angel fight.
Yeah.
That was taking place.
Yeah.
And so the outcome was certain.
Yeah, isn't it the same idea that comes about in the Old Testament too, is that whoever fights God's representative always loses, so long as the representative's on good terms with God, right? You think about any battle in the Old Testament, if God was on their side, it was a wipeout. If God wasn't, it was a disaster. In this text, we shouldn't be surprised that Michael won. right? Because he's fighting on God's behalf, on behalf of God's people. And so he wins, and Satan and his are thrown down. Or even whatever status they had, they've been cast down from that, and now they're stuck, waiting basically for the final buzzer, right? All right, other stuff you happen to, yes, sir?
It's obvious that all of us picked up on the same types of things. My comment was in verse 8 when it says, but he was not strong enough, referring to the dragon, and they lost their place in heaven. What's their place in heaven?
It's
Interesting, but
an interesting
that's
detail.
lost in translation, NIV, I don't know, but that was just kind of interesting to me that my idea of your place and the dragon would never be in heaven.
Yeah.
That's just kind of where the battlefield was. And did they come up from the earth? Because he was knocked down to the earth.
right.
I know we can't really answer some of that stuff. It's just interesting to.
Yeah, it's depicting a battle, and some of the details aren't going to make sense, like who is where. And, we're talking about things that are outside of our frame of reference. The only detail that popped into my mind was Satan comes before God in Job. And God asks him, "What are you doing?" "I've been going around on the earth," right? Well, he had some ability to talk, at least at that stage. Maybe that has been thrown. I don't know. That's a good question, right? What status he had, whatever it was, he lost it here in the battle. Yes, nice.
I think it's fascinating, and this may go back to what they would have seen in this, so it might be an overlap to that. But
Oh no, it's a good thing to do.
I think it's fascinating that the woman, once she is done, God is done with her basically, he takes her, he hides her, he nourishes her, he protects her, and even when the dragon comes after her, he gives her eagle wings. And it's just so powerful that God is continuing to watch over her and protect her and be with her and comfort her and so on and so forth. And it's just really powerful.
So, and since she represents God's faithful from any generation, right, before or after the cross, that's exactly what we saw God doing in the Old Testament with his people, protecting them. There's even the reference to just after the Exodus, God speaks of Israel. He says, "I have borne you on eagle's wings." Right? So there's a detail that gets tied in here. Those that are weary will mount up with wings like eagles, we're told in Isaiah, right? So there are details that are tied to God's people that John brings up here by inspiration, right? They are protected. There's even a curious, nobody said anything about the water and the earth. Was that yours? Okay. Yes.
I just had a question.
Okay.
So when you were talking about the woman being represented by God's faithful,
Yes.
how do you equate that with verse 17? So where it says, "So the dragon was furious with the woman and left to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and have testimony about Jesus." So how can she be both the faithful and her children are the faithful?
Because they have to be plural, I think, is the idea. You can't have just one faithful, right? We're called the children of God. It's almost like, Jesus. Well, it's like Jesus and the bride, right? Well, there's only one bride, but we're all members of that somehow. We're all considered children in that sense. Is that
But we're in that scenario where we're all the bride, right? We're the same.
right?
In this, it's being differentiated between the woman who birthed Jesus and the rest of her offspring. It's a different category of people. So I'm having a little trouble thinking that those are the same. You see what I did?
Yeah, and
you understand what I'm
I get where you're coming from. That if this is the woman, then she's making war with the offspring, and how does that work, right? The only thing I could think to put it together was, in the New Testament, we're called the bride, and we're also called the children, right? So it's like, well, which is it? Well, it's kind of both, right? As a singular unit, we are the bride, but then we are children, plural, of God. I think that might be how to take verse 17. Is those two together, and that may not make sense, but that's where I headed with that. Plus, because it's symbolic, it doesn't have to be literally true, right? Like every single thing doesn't have to be precisely step by step. Does that make sense? Because it's trying to depict something, not necessarily, give law or that kind of thing. I'm going to come back to the water. I haven't forgotten. Yes.
The other thing was, I thought it was interesting that the woman was in the wilderness. It reminds me of Elijah after Mount Carmel. Remember, he fled to the wilderness to escape Jezebel.
And there's another great Old Testament story about a woman who fled to the wilderness and then was provided for by God, and everything wound up being okay for her. It's Hagar, right? Hagar, the second time she goes in the wilderness, after she's actually told to depart, and God says that's what needs to happen. She's taken to the wilderness. Ishmael's about to die. She lifts up her eyes. She sees a well all of a sudden, right? A woman cast out that winds up being taken care of, is Hagar in that case. There we go. I'm glad you brought that up because that was exactly the next thing I had in my reference. Genesis 20 is Hagar, the second trip to the wilderness, and 1 Kings 17 is Elijah. He has prophesied that there would be no rain, and Jezebel's after him until he goes to the wilderness, and he's cared for by ravens. That story kind of harkens to this. Now, it's clear in the text that the dragon is Satan. I mean, it says as much, right? This is Satan. The depiction of the dragon reminds us of something we saw in Daniel, right? Daniel 7, what is described as the fourth beast, or the fourth kingdom to come about? It's Rome. And Rome's described not as a dragon, but as a great and dreadful beast with many heads and terrifying claws and teeth. I think that's a detail that's going to help us know what to do with chapter 13 as well. That which has to do with the dragon also has to do with Rome in this case. Right? And this makes sense because who is this written to? It's written to Christians in the first century under Roman rule being persecuted by Rome. Right? Rome is going to be the embodiment of the terrible things happening to the woman or to the offspring. Right? And that's going to help us both here and moving forward. Again, the child ruling with a rod of iron, that's clearly a reference to Jesus. The one, I mentioned Psalm 2 a moment ago, probably maybe a little lesser known, but Psalm 110, in reference to this, David says this, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." That sounds familiar because Jesus quoted that to the Pharisees, trying to get them to explain it, and they didn't know how, and it's because he was the actual answer. "The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will gather themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments," and so on and so on. It goes on in verse 5, "The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will execute judgments among the nations." Right? Those ideas of the servant of the son of the woman, the son of God, ruling and taking charge are highlighted in this chapter with Jesus. Okay, another detail from our studies in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 8, a figure is described as coming not from the fourth beast, but from the sort of the remnants of the fourth beast that sweeps away a third of the stars of heaven. Right? Well, in Daniel 8, it's a reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. And we talked about him at length when we talked about Daniel, right? He comes, he raises the temple, he destroys Jerusalem. It's considered the cataclysm of that event. One like Jesus actually mentions himself in Matthew. The dragon is described here in similar language, right? So is Satan literally sweeping away a third of the stars of heaven? Is there a big swath in the sky where we don't see stars? No, right? It's figurative. It's apocalyptic language. It's describing the cataclysmic power of this person or of this entity in Satan's case, right? Because Antiochus Epiphanes is described in the same language. I mentioned earlier, I've borne you on eagle's wings. The woman is given eagle's wings to go and be safe. God says that of his people in Exodus 19. He says it again in Deuteronomy 32. It's a good Old Testament thing to notice. Here's the water. I mentioned I wasn't going to forget about the water. What's the only other place in the Bible we read of the earth opening up for some reason? I'm thinking Korah's rebellion, right? Yeah. Remember Korah, he and his fellows, they come and they say, well, look, you, Aaron, you don't have to be the high priest. Anybody could do that. And Moses says, okay, if you still believe that, go over there by yourself and light some incense and we'll find out if you are or not. And in the story, the earth opens up and swallows them. There's a key word here. Swallows them for their what's the word? Not rebellion, insubordination, right? What does the earth do here in verse 16? The dragon tries to kill the woman and her offspring, those with water from his mouth. And then the earth opens its mouth and swallows the river. This is kind of like an anti-Korah event. The first time, the earth punished those who insolently spoke up against God. This time, though, the woman's innocent, right? And she's in danger. And so the earth actually works to save her. That which is created by God defends that which is created by God, right? God defends his own, and he does it with the earth here. Yeah.
This is not, if you think about it, this is not different than the flood. There were people, it saved, but it also condemned. And it's also Israel crossing the sea, the Red Sea, that they went through a dry ground, but yet Pharaoh was controlled.
Yeah. The earth coming to the help of the faithful.
Yeah, so it can both save on one side and destroy on the other.
God's creation working to save God's faithful, right? And we see a reference to that here. And so his only, his only recourse, the dragons, is to go fight against the followers of Jesus, right? Those who hold to the testimony of Christ. We missed this too, or I missed this. There's a couple times in the chapter where Jesus and God are equated, and that's happened a bunch already in Revelation, right? Several times Jesus is spoken of in the same language as God, or even simultaneously with him. In verse 10, I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come." Which is it? It's both, right? Together. You can't speak of Jesus coming with authority and God in the same breath unless they are the same, right? It would be blasphemous to do that. Also in verse 10 or verse 17, the second half of the verse, war is being made with. It says there are those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Right? Which is it? It's both, right? Which tells us something about God and Jesus. They're on par with each other. Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned that, but when Jesus came, he came with all authority from his Father.
Sure.
So didn't he speak as his Father?
Sure. Which is another how to tie that together, right? He spoke as God's representative with his authority.
In other words, he's our judge. He's going to be our judge. That's about as strong as you can.
Sadly, there are quote-unquote Christian perspectives that say, well, Jesus is, no, it doesn't work like that. Right? Did I see a wave? There.
It's interesting, in verse 11, it tells us how they won.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't win by raising a bigger army. And they didn't
Good point.
win by marching into Rome and taking over. It says they won by the blood of the Lamb, the word of their testimony, and by dying. That doesn't make any sense if you're looking at this from any other perspective other than spiritual.
Yeah.
You don't win by dying.
Yeah. It's the same way Jesus won. He wins by dying, right? And that's a good point, too. You see a lot in this chapter of how do you identify who are God's people now? And there are several of those, and 3 of them right there together. How do you know who God's people are if you're a Roman listener of this? It's those who've conquered by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of the testimony, and love not their lives to death. And then you get 2 references there at the end of the chapter, too. We're going to talk more about that in a second. Okay, we said this earlier. What major series of events is this centered around? This is referencing the crucifixion and the ongoing war between Satan and the church. How do the brethren overcome the power of the dragon? This is what was just mentioned, right? There in verse 11. By the blood of the Lamb, the word of their testimony, and they love not their lives to death. You get that. Okay, what will be the outcome of the dragon's war with the rest of the children? From the chapter. Where does it help us with what will be the outcome of the war, ultimately?
Christ will be victorious.
The salvation and the power have come, right? Rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. The battle is decided. It's just not quite over yet. right? There's a victory that's coming for God's people, right? He's going to make war with the rest of the offspring, sure. But there's a point in every world war and every war of any sort where the battle's decided. It's just not quite done yet, right? All this stuff hasn't quite happened yet. We think about the Revolutionary War, right? It was decided before Yorktown, but they still fought Yorktown, right? The war was decided at that stage, but there was that one final episode. And it's sort of what we see here at the end. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about Rome. That was for that period and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Has it ended yet?
No. But for the people it was written to, that's where they were, right? They couldn't. They had to see it from where they were, and where they were was Rome's persecuting them. The chapter helps us though with: is it really Rome doing it? Is it really Rome that's after the church? There's something behind that, right? There's something deeper. There's something bigger at play. And that's what the chapter helps us with. And it helps us in our own situations. Because we can look at our own situation and go, well, is it really this or that that's persecuting us? No. There's a power behind the throne. There's a power behind persecution. And this chapter identifies it clearly. Yes?
The other thing I wanted to discuss a little bit, talking a little bit about the dragon being cast down. Most people think about Satan being cast down at the creation, the beginning of time, and think about the war where Satan is being cast. But yet, that doesn't fit what's going on here.
Right.
Satan was in the presence of God, and then he wages war and is cast down, defeated here. And so that makes the point that the war people typically think about with Satan and God isn't the war that's being discussed here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different battle. This one seems to be directly related to the birth of the man, Jesus Christ.
And connecting back to the garden, of course, there's Genesis 3, right? The serpent, don't miss the word here because it's close to the one for dragon. Serpent would bruise the heel of the daughter of Eve, or I'm sorry, the son of the woman eventually, but that son would crush the head. And I think you see that being described here in different language, right? Satan's being crushed. He's cast down. He's no more what he used to be.
The other thing that I was thinking about that is thinking about in the book of Job. Remember that Satan was, he came up to God and made an accusation about Job. That there's nobody, because you put a hedge around him, no wonder he's faithful.
Right.
That sort of thing. And this, in the context here of what we're reading in Revelation 12, it's perfectly that Satan had a closer presence with God to make accusation, and now God is casting away because he's making war against the man-child and the offspring of the woman.
Yeah, the battle was struck and he lost, so there's now no, whatever it was before, it's not that way now, right? Okay, we've talked many times already about the readers of the book, right? To understand a text, you have to understand it from the perspective of the people it was written to first. We can take it to ourselves, but we have to get their idea first, because what it meant to them is going to shape what it means to us. So a Roman reader, a Christian in Rome or around Rome, around this time period, what would they have gathered from this? What would they have learned when this was read to them?
I think we've talked all around it, but if we look at verse 12, it says, "But woe unto you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." They could take great comfort in the fact that Satan's impact is limited. Mm-hmm. His time is short, and he is desperate, and he is panicking, if you will, to gather up the church and take them away from God and so on and so forth. So that really should have been very encouraging to these people, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. It's not a tragedy.
This isn't going to go on forever.
Yeah.
We got a reference to that too in verse 6. That 1260-day thing keeps coming up, right? That 3.5 years, 42 months. It's that limited, bounded amount of time, not forever, where these things are all happening. And you get it again here in this section. You're right, as you said, it's not going to last forever. On the flip side of that, what is not going to last forever is still going to be really bad.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So you got to this isn't sunshine and rainbows. This is really going to be awful for a bit.
It's not over, but that should encourage him a bit.
Yeah, it's still dark in the tunnel. Yes, sir.
I think the biggest take home for them is that the war has already been won. You know, when you read this, like they're in a war, they're in a persecution that we will potentially never understand.
I hope we
Where
don't.
we're being killed for our faith, where
Yeah.
we're being persecuted, beaten, and all that. Like we read about that. I don't think that's reality in our minds, you know, for us to understand that type of persecution. But these people dealt with this day in and day out, and they focused that on Rome.
Yeah.
That is what I'm battling.
Right.
This gives you an appreciation for what the dragon is. Like you said, there's something to Rome to persecute the way that it is. And honestly, it helps you appreciate. I mean that in the most respectful way, to how powerful Satan really is.
Sure.
You know, I mean, he was willing to go against the Creator, knowing what the Creator was. You know, he's willing to wage a war thinking he could potentially win. Why else would you have a war if you didn't think you could win? So, I mean, that, I guess, helps them understand what they're actually battling, but then realizing that, hey, the war was won, salvation is real, and even if we have to endure this and it's crummy and we hate it and it's all those things, we can be saved.
Yeah.
And I mean, it applies to us too, you know, but that's, I mean, what I would have taken from it.
And we could even word as we've been saved. It's just a matter of staying on his side, right? How evil does an entity have to be to understand he will lose to God and yet fight him anyway? Right? There's bad and then there's that, right? A being that is so completely devoted to evil that he will fight a battle that's losing just for spite because he can't do it any other way or won't do it any other way. But like you said, it's been won, right? And so the Romans could look at their persecution and go, yes, they're wearing Roman armor. It's not Rome, ultimately, that I'm fighting, right? It's something, there's something driving the narrative here. Yeah.
The other part about this, to those reading this at the time, there are going to be trials ahead, and it may be to the point of your own losing your life.
Mm-hmm.
But I think part of that, when you go into that, you're getting, if you will, you're getting a message from God that I know about this situation. This situation, you know, it may cost you your life, but I have not forgotten you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can win. If by losing your life you win. You know, you can win, still win the battle. That, if you will, God is still in control, even when he allows these other people to do these things.
Yeah.
And I would say, if I knew I might die for my faith and be persecuted by the government, my own people, my own nation, if I knew that might be the case, I think I would need some encouragement to continue on. Otherwise, Satan would get more than a third.
Yeah.
You know, in the image here.
I think about Jesus' teaching, and this adds it adds a lot more weight to when Jesus says, you know, the one who loses his life for my sake will find it, right? It adds these people knew what that looked like. They are in the middle of it. And so this comes back to why was Revelation written to them? Apocalyptic literature is written to people in distress, to encourage them to keep going through the distress, right? Why is Daniel and Ezekiel written that way? Because they're in exile. They're away from their home. They're in the worst possible place you could be. And this is where the Christians are at this stage. And so you get this message of hope written in the same kind of language as those other places. There's another passage, I'm going to run slam out of time, but there's a passage we have to read in this context. This is written a little earlier than Revelation was, but I'm thinking of 2 Corinthians 4, beginning in verse 7. Let me get to, because we've said some of this already. Also, you might remember Paul's, right, we war not against flesh and blood, but against, right? Paul's getting his listeners to say, look, you're not fighting this level. You're fighting stuff way above, right? You need to understand where that's coming from. But here's the passage, 2 Corinthians 4:7. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Remember in chapter 12 of Revelation where it says they won by the blood of the Lamb? That's not them, right? The first level is not about them at all. It's about Jesus. But then they win by doing two things. Holding to that, you might say that's the treasure here, maybe. And then being willing to do that even to the point of death. That's our line. Continuing 2 Corinthians. We are afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted but not forsaken. This is what you mentioned a moment ago. It is bad, but God hasn't forgotten us. Keep going. Struck down but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Right? It tells us why that mattered so much, right? And you're talking to a people that are in the middle of it.
You got to go to verse 5.
I got to go to verse 5.
That's what he's talking about.
Well, sure, absolutely. I was just highlighting
That's
the situation they're in.
we go back to Christ.
Right.
That's why Jesus went on the cross for us.
That's right. Without that, we wouldn't have any hope.
So I'm happy with that.
I agree.
I understand it.
All right. Anyway, a lot more we could say. If you're with us next week, we encourage you to do that. We're going to carry on to chapter 13. I didn't put that on here, but we're going to talk about the two beasts and how they relate to Satan and how they, I think, point us to Rome also. So thank you guys for your comments. Appreciate you having you here today.